betrayed by one of his own, abandoned by his closest friends, rejected by his own people, questioned in a public trial, traded for a criminal, mocked by spectators, spat, stripped, and struck by soldiers, crowned with thorns, beaten to a pulp. What certain hope could this possibly bring? What sort of king could Jesus possibly be? Humanly speaking, we know what led him there. Religious leaders had plotted against him. Roman authorities trialed him. Soldiers executed him. But what on earth was God doing? Jesus' disciples had been full of expectation, hoping that the time was drawing near when they would sit alongside their soon-to-be enthroned king, the king who would soon evict the Romans and establish God's long-awaited rule. But what's unfolding couldn't be further from that for which they had hoped. Disillusioned that things weren't going their way. Desperate to bring about the victory for which they longed. Despondent that perhaps the one they thought was the one was not. Jesus didn't match their expectations of what it looks like to be a king. Jesus doesn't match our expectations of what it looks like to be a king. Jesus' death? This doesn't seem hopeful, but hopeless. But Jesus has always been shifting the expectations of what it means to be king. Eating with those who he shouldn't be, choosing poverty over wealth, getting up close with the least, proclaiming good news to the lost, healing the sick, rebuking the powerful, feeding the hungry, forgiving the sinner, raising the dead, shepherding his sheep. The reason Jesus is a king like no other is because Jesus is like no one else and is about to do what no other can. See, despite appearance, don't be mistaken. For whilst it seems like things are out of his control, it's not the soldiers, nor the religious leaders, nor even Caesar who are calling the shots. This is not a misstep or a mishap or a detour in God's plans. No, we're told and reminded in Acts chapter 2 that Jesus was handed over by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. The one who stands there, beaten, bruised, and soon to be buried, he is the one with real authority, who expresses power not by building upon the sacrifice of others, but demonstrates his power by going to the cross to be the sacrifice for us. We often idealize or despise our leaders because we hope for so much and then are surprised in the ways in which they fall short. But we must realize that there is only one who can fully satisfy, who would make the toughest call of all. For he is the one who tread and forged a way through death itself that would not only be a victory over sin, but a conquering of death. No other crown could aspire, no other leader could attempt, but only one who is both God and King. He's not just a king. He's a king like no other. And this king has a cross. The people had long awaited a great saviour, someone, a great king, who would not only rescue them, but who would also come and put the world right. We long for that too. We long for someone more than ever who can overturn all the darkness and the pain and the suffering, remove our fears, someone who can take care of all of the sin and the suffering in the world. All throughout the Old Testament, from Exodus through to Isaiah, that's the hope that was longed for. That was the hope that was expressed. But when we read through Isaiah, and especially chapter 53, something surprising happens. The one who is supposed to bring the end of violence and injustice becomes the object of all violence and injustice. That they would be cut off from the land of the living. That they would be pierced, that is, they would be cut straight through. The vision that Isaiah foresees is that the long-awaited king would suffer. But it's not just the fact that he dies, but also the reason for his death that confronts. So he took our pain, bore our suffering, pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Punishment was on him. The prophet Isaiah says that he was a guilt offering. Guilt offerings took place when an animal was sacrificed to carry a person's guilt, but never ever were there human sacrifices. Yet the suffering servant Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice for guilt, on whom all our failings, shortcomings, and brokenness, our sin, was laid. Not just the failings of others, but the failings of you and me. It was the greatest swap in all of history, as the righteous one is exchanged for the unrighteous, as the innocent one dies in place of the guilty. See, Jesus didn't just enter into our pain and our suffering, our fears and our failures, and pretend that they're not real. He didn't dismiss the brokenness of our world and our lives. He didn't try to sweep our sin under the carpet. But he saw it. He looked at it with great clarity for what it is. And he took it upon himself on the cross. And he did it not because he needed to do it for himself, certainly not because it was easy for him, but in order to save you and me. That we would be forgiven because he loves us. Those hanging beside Jesus, they made fun of him. They thought it was a complete joke. Why didn't he save himself? Not because he was unable to, but because he was saving the likes of the very ones who taunted him. He was saving us. There was simply no other way. If there was, don't you think the Father would have found a way? That when Jesus prayed 3 times in the garden, Father, if there is another way, the Father would have said yes. But there was no other way. See, we cannot possibly do it on our own. We don't actually have it in the bag. We're not as self-sufficient as we once dreamed to be. We need a Saviour. We need someone greater than us, bigger than us, from the outside to rescue us. And as confronting as it is at first to recognise that we're part of the problem, it's glorious to see that the answer to our greatest need as we gather this Good Friday is right now in this very moment, closer than we ever dared dream to imagine. And that the answer is not more effort or more guilt or pretending that there's a problem, pretending that the problem doesn't exist, but the answer has a name, and the name is Jesus. That he is with us in our fear. He has carried every burden, was there at the beginning, will be there at the end, and right now, he's but a breath away. Do you know him? He is a king like no other. He is the Saviour of the world. Forgiveness has a name, and his name is Jesus. Everyone had been insulting him, but around midday, everything changes. An eerie, evil darkness falls. There's a sense of the entire universe, the spiritual, physical, emotional, everything collapsing in on this moment. Everyone would have been freaking out, wondering what is happening. Then there is this piercing cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a cry from the Psalms, Psalm 22, which Jesus must have known he was living out right in that very moment. There was his pain, more than physical agony on the cross. It was the pain of taking God's judgment on himself. This was no ordinary death. But there was more. He gave one final cry. And at the very moment, the curtain, the veil, the barrier to the throne room of God in the temple was ripped from top to bottom, the way to God's very presence was flung open at the very moment in Jesus' death. What was happening? What did this signify? What did it mean? His death breaks the barrier between us and God. Jesus became distant from his own Father in order that we could draw close to him by dealing once and for all with the problem of sin. Peter puts it like this, saying, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, for righteous and unrighteous, to bring you to God." A time which many have never felt more distant from one another. Part of the good news of the cross is that the certain hope that it brings, in which we take heart in and rejoice, is that the Lord is near. God is not a million degrees or a billion degrees of good behavior of separation from us. There's not even 6 degrees of separation, but one point of connection in Jesus. And as we're joined to him, we're also joined with one another. Jesus going to the cross opened a way for us to God. That sacrifices need not be repeated over and over again. We don't need to wait for the summing up and totaling of a scorecard to know if we've passed. But Jesus, through his death, has trampled down every barrier between us and him, even sin itself, as the curtain, the barrier, has been torn down so that you and I can draw close to him. Jesus' death is the way to God, but it also opens up the way to life. Because his death breaks the power of death. Matthew says that at that moment the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. The power of Jesus' death, as Matthew explains to us, is so overwhelming. It's such wonderful, great force that death has been overcome, that it could not be contained, and so it bubbles up and spills out and over so far that there are even those in Jerusalem who had died who were brought to life. The power of new life in Jesus, of a fresh start, of sin dealt with, of evil conquered, meant that those tombs themselves could no longer hold death. This was no ordinary death. It is a victory for you and me. It's a certain victory that shows us the true nature of God. Jesus is the King. Jesus is the Saviour. Jesus is the way. So take heart no matter what uncertainty we face, that as sure as Jesus died and emerged from death, that we have the basis for a certain hope that will last. We have been reminded this year that so many of the things that we thought were certain are not. That so many of the things for which we hope simply do not last. But the hope that we have in Jesus is certain because it's not connected to something for which we long, but because it's forged and founded in what Jesus has already done. And if you want to receive that hope, if you want to take grasp of that hope and build your life upon that hope, all you need to do is come to him. Like those surrounding who recognize in that moment that surely this is the Son of God. He's done everything necessary. And now all that is waiting is our move. Gracious God, we thank you so much that you have demonstrated your love for us with such immense clarity that while we were still sinners, whilst we were so far off, that Christ died for us. We thank you so much that Jesus is indeed the true King, that he is our Saviour. We thank you so much that he is the way. And so, Lord, this day, as we look upon the cross, we're reminded of our sin that put him there. And we want to say sorry. We are sorry for the ways in which we fall short. We are sorry that we have strayed. But we thank you that as we see Jesus for who he is, that he is the Lord and Saviour, that we can embrace the forgiveness that has been bought for us. Thank you that we can take heart even amidst great uncertainty, that we can have a certain hope because it's forged and grounded in Jesus. So Lord, please help us to draw close to you. Please help us to share that love with one another and are reminded that because of Jesus' death, that nothing can separate us from you as we put our trust in your Son.